Hey, what's up, guys? Trying out a new format this week using a more monitor sort of webcam setup compared to the last couple of weeks. I've been shooting on a secondary camera, so we're gonna see how this goes. Hopefully, I like this a little bit better. It's a little bit easier for me to set up, and I think it's gonna work out good. So, first things first that I want to tackle this week for this video is, just a little apology for last week. Last week was by far my worst event that I've done breaking down fights on this channel. I just didn't seem like I could get anything right. It was really brutal. That main card, I think I went like 1 for 5. Fluffy really just folded after one big knee from Strickland. He didn't do any offensive grappling like I really expected him to do. Strickland just looked locked in. The jab was really good. It was piecing up Fluffy. He couldn't find his range. When he did look like he was going to shoot for a takedown, it was honestly really ugly, sloppy takedown. So, pretty brutal event last week. Didn't make any money. Fluffy sold. One of the big 3-leg parlays that I had last week went 2 for 3 with Fluffy selling it. The other 3-leg parlay that I threw went 0 for 3. So Del Valle lost via unanimous decision against Jordan Levitt and was getting spanked on the butt in the third round. Ante Delija, closer fight. Wasn't mad about that pick. I honestly think what lost him that fight was just the amount of damage he wore on his face. I think, if he would have been able to split open Spivak as early as he was split open himself, he probably would have shaken out the decision there, but it wasn't a good look on the judges' scorecards. And then the last fight was Jeff Neal, who got clearly chin-checked pretty hard. He needs probably quite a bit of time to recover after that. The Protez knockout did a lot more than people think because he just got tapped, sort of equilibrium tap, like right on the temple, and was out cold and blew a nasty snot rocket as soon as he hit the ground, which was absolutely disgusting. So, my apologies for last week. There's nothing I can do about it now. Get back into the lab. Try to do everything I can to make some money this week. The first thing I'm going to say about this card, before we even get into breaking it down, is it's like extremely difficult to find value on this card. A lot of these fights are extremely wide, like, multiple minus 500 or wider picks on this card. Another thing to notice about this card is it's also like basically half of these fights are including somebody making their UFC debut from the Contender Series. Let me just check that. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fights on a 13-fight card. So almost half of the fights on a 13-fight card are going to be debutants. So picking debut fighters is tough sometimes. Last week it worked out well with John Paul Labusniani, but who, by the way, put on probably the best performance of any one of my picks on the card last week. So shout out JPL. I'm definitely a big fan of his game. But yeah, we're going to get into this one. This week I did a little bit more research, just sort of looking into these fighters' past, and I feel a little bit more comfortable about some of these fights. But like I said, it's going to be really hard to come up with some value in the end. So starting us off, we got Eric Silva versus Francis Marshall. I think this is going to be sort of the UFC throwing a bone for Francis Marshall here. Has had a tough run in the UFC. He's 2-3 in his last 5. Wins over Dennis Buzuka and Marcelo Rojo, with losses to William Gomez in a split decision, Isaac Dolgarian, who a lot of controversy around Dolgarian, and then most recently a split decision loss to Myron Santos, who I personally think Santos is like a really good fighter, and the fact that Marcel was able to shake out one of the judges' scorecards in that fight, I think is respectable. This is a fight with a 12-year age gap. Eric Silva, he won his Contender Series fight almost 4 years ago now. Since then, 2 fights inside the UFC octagon. lost by submission, and then by knockout, well, TKO in his last fight. Hurt his leg like 40 seconds into the fight against Muhammad Naimov. So, I think that, Marshall minus 530 favorite here probably makes sense. All right, let me close the ad. Marshall probably minus 530 favorite here. It definitely makes sense. I'm going to lean with him. He's probably going to get this one done. Hopefully his first UFC finish in like 3 years. So I'm gonna lean towards Francis Marshall to get this one done by finish. Silva's been finished twice inside the octagon. He's 38 years old, about to be 39 here in a month. Francis Marshall, 26, about to be 27. So 12-year age gap, almost to the exact week. They're only born, looks like, about a week apart from each other. And 94% of the Tapology community is on Marshall, which makes sense. He's a solid fighter. He's got really solid grappling and wrestling. Striking has looked better in his last couple bouts. I watched some highlights. He has fairly crisp boxing for a guy that's definitely a more wrestling base. So yeah, gonna lean with Francis Marshall here. Try not to think too hard about that one. Moving on next, this is definitely probably one of the trickier ones in my mind on the card. I have my mind made up, but Javier Reyes versus Douglas Silva de Andrade. Silva de Andrade has been a tricky guy for a lot of UFC fighters. He's 3-2 in his last 5. He's got wins over Gaetano Perello, Sergey Morozov, lost a fight to Said Nurmagomedov by decision, beat Cody Stamann, and then most recently lost to Miles Johns almost 2 years ago now. The biggest flaw in Silva de Andrade's game is the fact that he's going to be 41 here in a couple months. He's one of the older fighters on the UFC roster. He's going to be 3 inches shorter in this fight and have about a 5-inch reach disadvantage, 4.5 inches to be exact. Javier Reyes is making his UFC debut, coming off of a nice knockout finish over Justice Torres in the Dana White's Contender Series. He's one of 6 DWCS debutants on this card. There's multiple DWCS alums on this card. I believe Silva and Marshall, who we just broke down, were also Dana White Contender Series guys. So I'm going to lean with Javier Reyes here. This is another one of those examples where guy is, almost 10 years younger, couple inches taller, has a longer reach, is coming off of the biggest win in his career and is looking to impress in his UFC debut. I'm going to lean with Reyes, probably to get this one done by finish. Let me preface, Douglas Silva de Andrade is actually pretty solid. He's very technical. He's pretty rounded in every aspect of his game, with his striking, his grappling, his wrestling, his get-ups, takedown defense. All that stuff is actually pretty rounded. And that's the reason that he's only a plus 190 underdog in this fight. But I do like Javier Reyes. I think there's a lot of value here. This is one of the value picks on the card for me, where a guy coming off his biggest win in his career so far, he's got 27 professional fights under his belt. Silva de Andrade, he's 8 years older, and he's only got, a couple more fights than Javier Reyes, which is pretty crazy. So I'm going to lean with Javier Reyes here. He's one of my favorite picks on the card. I'll be mentioning his name later when we're putting together our parlay. So moving on. Up the card, we got Ernesta Karakaite. I always mess up the way to say her name. Karakaite or Karakaite against Sofia Montenegro. This is a super interesting fight. This is one of the first fights on the card that I feel fairly comfortable and confident in an underdog here. I hate feeling confident in any women's fight ever because they just seem to be so volatile, and you just never know what's going to happen in these events. But watching the DWCS closely this past season, I feel pretty comfortable with a lot of the first-year alumni that are about to be making their debut here at this card. I feel very comfortable making picks on these guys because I have seen them. I've done research on them twice now, entering their DWCS fights a couple months ago, and then now doing some more research on them again now as they enter their UFC debuts. Montenegro did lose her Dana White Contender Series fight. That was a couple months ago now, 4 months ago, almost 5 months. She did lose the fight, but the fight was so good that she earned a contract. I think there was 3 or 4 fights on this season that were so good that Dana awarded a contract to both the winner and the loser of the fight. And she was a part of one of them. She's a brawler, just an all-around scrapper. That last fight was awesome. It was truly one of the better fights on the Contender Series this past year. She went to war with Jaisla Chavez, and it was a super close fight. I remember thinking it could have gone either way. I think it was a unanimous decision. It was a split decision loss, so I do think it could have gone either way. I personally remember picking Montenegro in that fight during the Dana White Contender Series, having money on her as an underdog then, and thinking she probably should have won. So I'm going to lean with her this time around against Ernesta. Ernesta, she is 4-1 in her last 5, but as you can see, outside of the UFC Octagon, 3 years, 5 months ago, split decision. 3 years ago against Laetita Blotz, split decision. Carly Judice in her Contender Series fight, split decision. Lost a unanimous decision to Dione Barboza, and then most recently in her last fight, a win against Nicole Cagliari in a split decision. So that means 4 of her last 5 fights, every single one of her wins, her last 4 wins, have been by split decision. And that tells me one thing, that she's in close fights, and that damage is probably going to be a big difference maker in this bout. And I feel fairly confident in Montenegro being able to out-damage her on the feet. So I'm going to lean with Montenegro here. She says she's plus 265 underdog here on Tapology. Let me see if there are... Let me refresh these best fight odds here. So, yeah, UFC Mexico. Doesn't look like she's on... For some reason... Oh, here we go. Here's the prelims. Yeah, so now she's floating closer to plus 205, plus 210. Tapology says she's plus 265. I don't know if there's been a shift. I don't know if that's what she opened at, and that's what she's floating at now on Tuesday when I'm recording this video. I would hop on Montenegro now. I think there's good value there. This is one of the first women's bouts of the year this year that I feel solid taking the underdog in. So, moving on up the card. Christian Quinones versus Chris Moutinho. This is honestly a tough one for me because Quinones is a minus 650 favorite. Let's check that, just double check. Yeah, close to minus 700 on some books, and Moutinho is anywhere from plus 425 to plus 500. This is honestly a really tough one for me because Chris Moutinho actually looked really solid outside of the UFC when he lost that fight to Sean O'Malley. Everybody knows about that fight where he took ridiculous amount of significant strikes in that bout and was just bloody to all hell, but stayed up, kept fighting. Awesome fight. Left the UFC, got released shortly after that. Went on a nice run outside the Octagon. Got a couple of finish wins, I believe, in a row. On a couple different fighting series. Yes, one of the guys who he fought is 6-7 now. But Johnny Campbell knocked him out a year, 3 months ago. And then the dude gets his call back to the UFC, right? And who do they match him up against? Malcolm Wellmaker. So, this dude has fought Sean O'Malley and Malcolm Wellmaker as 2 of his last 3 bouts in the UFC, which it's just absurd. I know Wellmaker's bouncing off, or is going to be bouncing off, his first loss of his career inside the UFC Octagon, but I still rank Malcolm Wellmaker very highly. I think this is a guy who's going to be a future top 5 contender at 135 pounds, and that last fight was tough. He was expecting to fight somebody completely different. Took a 4 days notice, short notice replacement guy, and the dude was game. And he was a guy that, a lot of people had on their UFC radar for the last couple of years. And, he proved to people that he belonged in the UFC. And I'm excited about Ethan Ewing, about watching him in the future. But, that's besides the point. We'll stop talking about Wellmaker. We'll get to talk about him again in hopefully the distant future. But, yeah, dude gets his call back to the UFC. has to fight Malcolm Wellmaker, who's on just an insane run. Fighting in Atlanta, I believe. I believe it was the Usman versus Buckley card in Atlanta. Obviously, Wellmaker is a Georgia guy. He's from Augusta, and so yeah, I mean, just an impossible task for him, right? I believe Wellmaker was like minus 800 in that fight. And he knocked Moutinho out with a disgusting right hook, right? The check hook, best punch in his bag. But Moutinho is bouncing back here, a plus 420 underdog against a guy who, inside the UFC octagon, he won his Contender Series fight 4 years ago now. Since then, 4 years, 3 months ago, he's only fought 3 times in the last 4 years and 3 months. He won his UFC debut over Kale Tara by KO, and then he's lost back-to-back bouts. One by submission against Kyung Ho Kang, and one by submission against Raoni Barcelos. I think Moutinho has solid striking. I think he's got solid Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I think he's got okay wrestling. And I think that this is a fight that, if you don't feel like taking the side of a minus 650 favorite, which I personally never do, it's worth a little sprinkle on Chris Moutinho moneyline. I know that might sound crazy, especially with the odds being this wide, and I'm not going to go out there and say, Moutinho is some lock, you should put him in your parlays, you should put, $15, $20, $25 on it. No. If you want to have fun watching this fight, throw a little 5-piece on Chris Moutinho, sweat it out, maybe you can win 5x your money, right? That's personally what I'll be doing. Quinones is okay, but you drop back-to-back fights. You're 1-2 inside the UFC octagon. You're fighting against a guy that I thought actually made some improvements in his time outside of the UFC octagon. I don't think the betting odds here make a lot of sense. I'm just going to double-check them real quick. Yeah, we did just look at those just a second ago. It looks like he's, minus 700 on some books, so pretty crazy to me. I'm gonna go with Moutinho as a little value pick. Quinones will probably win. The underdogs picks have not been happy to very kind to me this year so far, and I know I'm already taking Montenegro in this card as one of my favorite underdogs. So don't consider Moutinho one of my favorite underdogs, but I just think that there's probably some value there. Quinones probably gonna knock him out in the first 30 seconds of the fight for all I know, but I just think there's solid value there, and I'm probably going to put just a little 5-piece on Chris Moutinho. So moving on up the card, we've got Macy Chiasson versus Aylin Perez. This is one I'm probably not going to break down too long. Perez is on a really solid win streak right now. 5-0 in her last 5 fights inside the UFC octagon. Wins over people like Jocelyn Edwards, Daria I'm not even going to try to. Zeleznikova, and then a win over Carol Rosa in her last fight. She's a couple years younger than Chiasson. Chiasson, she's usually pretty game bred. She likes to go out there and scrap. But, for a women's fighter, she's fairly violent. 2-3 in her last 5 losses to Irina Aldana, Ketlin Vieira, and Yana Santos most recently. With her wins coming over Pani Kianzad and Mara Bueno Silva. With she sort of elbowed her nasty cut, and it was a doctor stoppage win for Chiasson. She's solid. She's tall. She's almost 6 feet tall, which honestly, personally, didn't even really know that she was that tall. I knew that she was a bigger, a bigger girl for 135 pounds in terms of height, but I did not know that she was almost 6 feet. So 5'11" for Chiasson. She's going to have a significant height advantage and a significant reach advantage in this fight, which I imagine is probably something that she has had in every one of these fights that she's lost as well. I'm not going to double check that right now, but I would imagine that Yana Santos, Ketlin Vieira, and Irene Aldana aren't close to 6 feet tall, nor do they have a 72-inch reach. So Aylin Perez, solid striking, really good wrestling. She's great up against the cage. I'm just going to roll with her here. She's minus 165. I think there's decent value there. Probably going to put together a women's parlay by the end of this with, I think there's only 2 women's fights on the card, so I'll probably put together a little women's parlay with Aylin Perez and Sofia Montenegro. But, I'm going to lean with Aylin here. I think she's going to get it done, keep the winning streak alive, and move up in the UFC rankings. And she's also Argentinian. So, Ailin Perez, Sofia Montenegro, Argentinian women's parlay? I think so. Moving on up the card, definitely a super fun one. Wes Schultz versus Damian Pinas. We're just going to refer to him as Damian for the rest of the video. Sorry, that was my attempt at a little joke. Bit cheeky, but, you know. Damian versus Wes Schultz. Interesting fight here. Watched both of these guys on the last series of the Dana White Contender Series. Last season of the Dana White Contender Series. Sorry, I don't know why I can't talk right now. Damian won by knockout over Vitor Costa, and Wes Schultz won by submission over Mario Mingaj. Schultz pulled out a Suloev stretch, which was the first time I've ever seen a submission like that watching live. It was ridiculous. Essentially, he pulled, the dude's leg above his head to the point where, it looked like his hamstring was about to rip in half and got him to tap, which was pretty nasty. I think Wes Schultz is fun, and I think he is going to win some fights inside the UFC octagon. But I don't reckon this is going to be the one for him. I think Damian's going to be able to get this one done. The battle of the DWCS debutants. This is the only fight that has two guys making their debut going up against each other. Personally, I kind of hate that. I would hope to see, both of these guys get built up against sort of less end UFC, like sort of back end UFC competition, guys that are at the end of their contracts or, maybe might be getting ready to be released by the promotion. You would like to see these guys matched up against somebody like that first, then maybe fight each other, down the line in the future. But it's going to be interesting nonetheless. Both of these guys 6'1". Damian's going to have a 79.5-inch reach to Wes Schultz's 77, so about a 2.5-inch reach advantage. And he's minus 250 on the money line here, which I think is good value. He looked really solid in his last fight. The striking was crazy. The power is very clearly there. He looks he's very physically imposing inside the octagon. And Schultz certainly showed some signs of sloppiness in his fight. I remember watching that with my friends and all of us sort of thinking at the same time, like, okay, this guy, maybe if he was matched up against somebody else, maybe this wouldn't have gone this way, right? Grappling in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu certainly is there. Obviously he showed that last time around that he's got some pretty crazy submission bag. But, I think Damian Pinas is going to be able to get this one done. 23 years old, about to be 24 here in a couple weeks. Great Muay Thai, great striking. I'm going to lean with him here. I think he looked like one of the better prospects off this last season, and I think he's going to be able to get this one done against Wes Schultz. Moving on up the card, Jose Medina versus Ryan Gondra. So another UFC debut here for Ryan Gondra, another DWCS guy from this past season. He's going up against Jose Medina, who is just known for getting punched in the face. 0-4 in his last 4 bouts. Lost his Contender Series fight to Magomed Gadzhiesulov. Lost his sort of UFC debut to Zach Reese by UD. Reese landed some massive strikes on him here. It looked like Medina had a pretty crazy chin in that fight. Still, like I said, got punched in the face so much that he lost unanimously. Then he got knocked out by a knee by Oteva Gautier. Gautier landed some massive strikes on this dude's face, just like I was saying, and he was sort of mocking him, like, oh, bring it on, bring it on. And then, within 30 seconds, Gautier just unloaded an absolutely nasty clip of punches and kneed him right in the face. And that was the fight. And then most recently, 5 months ago, got submitted by Dusko Todorovic. I think Gondra could probably win this one any way he pleases, to be completely honest with you. If he plans to knock this guy out on the feet with strikes, I think Medina's chin is okay. Like I said, he couldn't get knocked out with some of the punches that Oteva Gautier was throwing, and he's probably one of the more physically imposing fighters in the entire UFC octagon. Or on the entire UFC roster right now, I should say. Gondra, he is 8-1, 5-0 in his last 5. knockout wins inside the LFA, and then won his Contender Series fight over Trent Miller via knockout. This is an interesting fight at 185 pounds. I think Gandra looked pretty solid last time around. I think I may have faded him in his Dana White Contender Series fight for the underdog that he was fighting, and he knocked him out, I'm pretty sure, in the first round. So I'm going to lean with Gandra here. I think he'll be able to get this one done. I think there's no value here, so maybe if you want to put together a really long parlay, maybe throw him in as an extra leg, but personally I wouldn't. At minus 550, a guy making his Dana White Contender Series debut against a dude who has a fairly solid chin and nothing to lose, considering he's 0-4 in his last four fights, and with a loss here is going to get cut from the UFC. I probably would be fairly cautious here, but Gandra shouldn't have any problems getting this one done. Moving on up the card, main card opener. So getting into the main card here, I believe we've got 6 fights left. Daniel Zellhuber versus Bobby Green. Not going to have much to say here. Bobby Green's last fight was legitimately terrible. It looked so bad. It was a split decision against Lance Gibson Jr. I remember watching it initially and being like, oh, Bobby won that fight. No doubt. I can't believe they gave a split decision. I just rewatched the highlights from that fight the other day. I totally understand why it was a split decision. Personally, I think Bobby deserved to just be robbed and, given another loss on his UFC record with how bad that fight was. It was just him, walking around with his hands by his sides, drooping his shoulders forward and stuff like that, sort of calling him on to try to punch him in the face. And then as soon as you try to, throw a strike, he'd just step out of range and then just throw a jab. Super boring fight, terrible fight, and Bobby Green tried to act like he put on some awesome performance and that he won so dominantly against the guy who was fighting 4-30 competition in his last couple fights in Lance Gibson Jr. I remember when we broke that down 2 months ago on one of my first videos on this series. I literally saw that Lance Gibson had fought some dude a couple months prior that was 25 wins under 500 in his career, which was just insane. He had 25 more losses than he did have wins. Obviously, has been knocked out in fancy fashion against Mauricio Rufy, one of the best knockouts of all time. Triangle choke / arm barred unconscious by Paddy Pimblett. Lost to Jalen Turner in one of the more vicious knockout losses in the last couple of years, too. Took a whole bunch of unnecessary strikes. His only wins in the last 5 fights are against Jim Miller, Lance Gibson Jr. Zellhuber's going to bounce back with a massive win here. I think he's probably going to get this one done by finish, personally. I think Zellhuber's actually pretty solid. No, he's 0-2 in his last 2 fights, but close fight at UFC Noche against Esteban Ribovic, who, in my opinion, is one of the best 155-pound prospects in the entire sport right now. And then, he got quote-unquote fraud checked, but, who better to do it than Michael Johnson, a guy who's been in the UFC for a long time, has fought the best of the best, like Dustin Poirier, top-level guys like that. And this is a guy who's still young. He's 26 years old. He's 13 years younger than Bobby Green. He is minus 500. Just going to double-check that real quick. Yeah, minus 500 to minus 560 with Bobby Green. Anywhere from plus 350 to plus 410. I'm sure some people will probably take the value side of Bobby Green just because he's coming off of a win. And Zellhuber, just lost to Michael Johnson a few weeks ago. But for me, I don't see it. I don't think it makes sense at all. And I'm going to lean with Daniel Zellhuber to get this one done. The age difference, the height difference, the reach difference, and then just, the run that Bobby's been on. And Zellhuber needs a comeback win. I think he's going to get this one done in fancy fashion. I reckon he probably gets this one done by a finish. Moving on up the card, Santiago Luna versus Angel Pacheco. So this is another one that's just incredibly wide. 98% of the Tapology audience is on Santiago Luna. Angel Pacheco is a guy that probably should have never been in the UFC in the first place. Lost his Contender Series fight to Danny Silva, and then fought Calvin Loughran, almost 2 years ago now, and lost unanimously. I'm not going to break this one down for too long. Luna's going to have a height advantage. He's going to have a reach advantage. He's 13 years younger. He's a Mexican fighter fighting in Mexico. There's something to be said that basically every Mexican fighter on this card fighting in their hometown is probably going to fight with a little bit more pride and a little bit more, a power. And I think Santiago Luna should be an absolute lock to get a finish in this fight, especially considering, Angel Pacheco probably never really deserved to be in the UFC in the first place. And Luna's one of the younger guys on the roster. Had an awesome fight with Quang Lee a couple months ago. I remember that fight like it was yesterday. Nasty knockout win. And he's a fun prospect. One of the younger guys on this card. Not sure if he's the youngest guy, because next we're going to get into Imanol Rodriguez. So we'll check. I will verify. But as of right now, the youngest fighter we've broken down. And I think he gets this one done by knockout or by submission pretty easily. Probably going to lean with him by knockout. So moving on off the card to Imanol Rodriguez. I think Imanol's a little bit younger. Let's see. He's not. My bad. I have negative ball knowledge. Clearly, Imanol's 26. For some reason, I thought he was really young, like 21. So he's older than I thought. My mistake. But 6-0 guy going up against Kevin Borjas here. These odds are a little bit more wide than I'd like them to be. Borjas is 2-3 in his last, 5 fights, 1-3 inside the UFC octagon. Only win coming over Ronaldo Rodriguez, who actually is pretty solid. It's a pretty good win. But losses to Sumadarji, Alessandro Costa, and Joshua Vaughn. Vaughn, clearly the champion. Alessandro Costa, not really the greatest. I know he got knocked out by Alden Correa in one of his last fights. And then Sumadarji, always sort of a tricky opponent. Imanol won his Contender Series fight by knockout. I know he's got a lot of hype behind him. Again, another one of these Mexican fighters in Mexico City. To me, this just makes sense. Borjas is going to have a little bit of a height and reach advantage. But, slightly younger guy in Imanol, fighting, in his home country, undefeated guy, put on the main card in his UFC debut. Another one of the DWCS debutants. I think Imanol Rodriguez probably runs through Kevin Borjas here. I don't see any way Borjas is going to be able to get this one done. I think Imanol is a really solid prospect at 125 pounds, and I think he'll be in the rankings before we know it. So I'm going to lean with Imanol Rodriguez, and I'm going to move on up the card to Edgar Chairez versus Felipe Bunez. An interesting one for sure. Chairez has had an interesting run inside the UFC octagon. In his last 5 fights, he's 2-2-1 with a no contest against Daniel Lacerda due to a premature stoppage. Tatsuro Taira, loss on your record isn't bad considering he's about to fight for the belt and is like 8-1 inside the UFC octagon with his only loss coming to Brandon Royval. And then your wins, he avenged his win against Daniel Lacerda after a premature stoppage. Won by triangle choke almost 2 years ago now. Then he lost to Joshua Vaughn, the current champ. So, like I said, this dude's last 2 losses, Joshua Vaughn, Tatsuro Taira, they're literally fighting each other for the 125-pound belt right now, which I think automatically that, in my mind, goes, okay, this dude is going to the cards with Tatsuro Taira and Joshua Vaughn. The Felipe Bunez, finishing potential, it's almost zero in my mind, considering he can withstand 3 rounds against, some of the best prospects at 125 pounds that we've seen in the last 10 years. And then most recently picked up a nice rear naked choke win against CJ Vergara. This is another pick that I think has a lot of good value. Another Mexican fighter fighting in Mexico. I think Chairez is going to be able to get this one done. Bunez doesn't really do anything for me. A couple nice wins inside the LFA. Also lost to Joshua Vaughn, but he was knocked out by him, which is different than Chairez. Chairez took him to the cards. There is something to be said there. And then he won against Jose Johnson, who's like that ridiculously tall UFC flyweight guy, but he's pretty shit. And then most recently lost a unanimous decision to Rafael Estevam, which I can remember betting on Rafael in that fight. Chairez is going to have a little bit of reach advantage. These guys are the same height. Chairez is about 6 years younger. Again, like I said, going to lean with the Mexican side here. Fighting in your home country just does something. Being able to take the current champion and the title challenger to the cards in your last 5 fights and still being right at an even 500 record. It's impressive. His 2 wins that he's gotten are both by submission finish. So I think Edgar Chairez either wins this one on the cards or he gets a submission against Felipe Benitez. So I'm going to lean with Chairez, probably just going to take the money line on the parlay, but I do think a submission is a very good prop there. Okay, on to the co-main event. This is a super fun one. Chito Vera versus David Martinez. This is one of those ones that I am having a tough time with, because I feel like Chito is bound for some form of bounce-back win. But at the same time, David Martinez on a crazy run inside the UFC octagon, 2-0 inside the octagon with wins over Simon Oliveira and most recently a win over Rob Font in a fight that I believe he was a sizable underdog in. Again, Mexican fighter, fighting in Mexico. I just think that that's going to push him over the edge here. Chito, as much as I love him, he is 1-4 in his last 5. Granted, these fights are against guys like Corey Sandhagen, where he lost by split decision, so one judge did give him the cards. Sean O'Malley in a title shot. Davison Figueiredo, who at the time at 100, moving up to 135 pounds, looked like he could potentially be a title challenger. And then most recently, 4 months ago, Ayman Zahabi in a super close split decision fight that I think could have gone either way. I think Chito might be bound for a bounce back. And because of that, I'm going to do what I think is best, and I'm going to lean away from picking a fighter in this fight in terms of betting. My heart is leaning Marlon Chito Vera. My mind is leaning David Martinez. I think David Martinez is likely going to be able to get this one done, as he may be a little bit shorter in terms of height and reach, but younger guy on a better win streak, fighting in his home country, looking to go 3-0 inside the UFC octagon, coming off of a nice win against a guy like Rob Font, who I think personally would be a super close, basically pick 'em fight against Chito Vera. I'm going to have to lean with David Martinez as my official pick here. I'm not going to bet on this fight just because I have such a tough time with it. I want to watch this as a fan, and I'm going to be rooting for Chito Vera, but I do think in my mind that David Martinez gets this one done. So do what you will with that. If you don't like Chito Vera, fade him. Take David Martinez. There's probably good value there. Moving on to the main event. Brandon Moreno versus Loner Kavanagh. I've had some time to think about this one. And I'm just going to flat out say that Moreno is going to get this one done. I feel confident that we're going to have a bounce back week this week. I think we are going to win some parlays this week. I think we are going to, really bounce back from a super shitty performance last week that I feel like crap about. It was a tough watch, and it was almost comical watching it all just sort of fall apart. Moreno 2-3 in his last 5, but this dude's fighting literally the best people that you could possibly fight at 125 pounds. Pantoja, former champ, split decision. Royval, split decision loss. One of my favorite fighters at 125 pounds. Then picks up a nasty win against Amir Albazi and Steve Erceg back-to-back, and then most recently lost by knockout to Tatsuro Taira in what I think was a bit of a premature stoppage. But what can I say? Taira's fighting for the belt now. If Moreno would have shaken out that fight in which he was the favorite to win, he'd be fighting for the belt right now against Joshua Vaughn. So, and that might be on this card, even though it's a fight night, which probably wouldn't be. Probably be a different Mexican fighter in the main event, but I don't know if they'd have been able to find anybody, to be honest with you. Loner Kavanagh is good, and I think he will have his time. But coming off a loss, dude, I don't know if this is the guy that I would have had replacing, I believe it was Asu Omabayev, who was supposed to be in this fight initially. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find that. But I think Asu Omabayev was initially supposed to be the guy fighting Kavanagh. Or fighting Moreno. I don't think if I would have personally replaced Omabayev with Loner Kavanagh. I think there's probably some better guys at 125 that could have put together a better main event for one and just a closer fight. I think he's just going to get schooled here in this fight. I think it's going to be another one of those examples where Moreno walks down a guy like Albazi or like Steve Usyk, just because the experience just isn't necessarily there yet. And Kavanagh, I think he's going to be really good. He was undefeated before losing, by knockout to Charles Johnson in his last fight. And he had some solid wins, beat Jose Ochoa, who I think is actually a really solid 125-pounder. Same with a nice one against Felipe Dos Santos. And then, fights Charles Johnson, who's notorious for checking the prospects, putting together nasty knockout combinations, and getting stuff done. So this is tough. Coming off of a knockout loss, I just can't bring myself to picking Loner Kavanagh here. I think he's going to be getting schooled in this fight. And I think Moreno, he knows, he recognizes the threat that is across from him. He doesn't think that this is some easy fight that he's just going to run through, but I think he's going to take this very seriously, considering, 2-3 in his last 5, coming off of a loss after a nice little 2-fight win streak against solid opponents like Usyk and Albazi. So, Moreno's going to be taller. He's going to be a longer reach. He's going to be stronger, better wrestling, better grappling. Loner may be a little bit better on the feet, but I don't think we're going to see much of that in this fight. I think Moreno is really going to implement a strong game plan, get back into the win column, especially considering he's fighting in his home country, in front of all of his home fans. He's, arguably him and Yair Rodriguez, the two sort of most famous Mexican fighters on the UFC roster right now. And I think Moreno, in front of his home crowd, should be able to run away with this one, get a nice win. So that brings us to my favorite portion of this video, where we're gonna put together some parlays. Starting off with our two three-leg parlays of the week. I'm gonna take Brandon Moreno, Edgar Chairez, and I believe, Javier Reyes. So we're gonna go Javier Reyes, Edgar Chairez, Brandon Moreno, 3 legs. Gonna flash that up on the screen. Other parlay I'm going to run, I'm going to go Imanol Rodriguez, Daniel Zellhuber to win by knockout or decision, and then Damian Pinas. That's my 2 3-leggers for the week. My underdog for the week, my underdog parlay for the week is going to be Aylin Perez and Sofia Montenegro. That is going to sort of double as my women's parlay, underdog parlay. 2 Argentinian fighters. Aylin is the favorite, but Montenegro is pretty wide underdog, so you'll be able to get some solid value there. And then if you want to, have fun, sprinkle a little something on Chris Moutinho, but I'm personally going to stay away from that. I'm going to stay away from the Silva-Francis Marshall fight because there's really no value there. In terms of parlays, definitely going to stay away from that Moutinho fight like I just mentioned. Going to stay away from the Medina Gandra fight just because I think no value there and just, too wide. And then Santiago Luna, if you can find knockout or submission props at good value, sprinkle a little bit on both, but I'm going to lean away from that. And then I think everything else we have a little bit of stake in. So, except for Chito Vera versus David Martinez, which I said I was not going to be betting on this week. So those are my parlays for the week. We're due for a bounce back. I feel confident in my picks. My 2 parlays I like. I know sounded a little unconfident there when I was putting it together, but I was just trying to remember the order that I picked. I had 6 guys that I knew I was going to put into 2 separate parlays, but I couldn't remember which 3 and 3 I did off the top of my head, but I know I got that right. So going to flash those up on the screen. I think we're going to bounce back with a big week this week. Who better? Let's get this one done. This fight card is kind of shaky, but next week's going to be a super fun breakdown because BMF belt is on the line. Charles Oliveira, Max Holloway, couple other super fun fights on that card. RDR versus Kyle Baralho. These are just the ones that I'm remembering off the top of my head, but some great bouts on that card. Gonna do a bunch of research for that, and I think we're gonna have some profits from this week's card to play with going into next week's fight. So thank you guys for watching like always. Leave a like, comment, subscribe. I truly appreciate it. I know views, likes, comments have been down last couple of videos, but that's just sort of as expected, because I knew I was going to get sort of a pop when I first did this with just friends and family. But since this is sort of a niche market that I'm covering, it's definitely a little bit harder to get consistent views. But what really helps me is leaving a like, subscribing to this video if you if you've seen some of my stuff in the past, or if this is the first video that you've watched and this shows up on your feed. I really appreciate it if you give me a subscription. So thank you guys. As always, let's win some money. Let's bounce back this week with a great week. And I'll see you guys next week for UFC 326, Holloway versus Vera. Peace.